Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's video. So last week we had the material gotchas video and it was very well received. So this week I'm going to opt for another gotcha video with 15 more gotchas. So since I don't have them in one category, we are skipping over different categories. So we have some in the light category, we have some in the scene category, and last but not least, we have some in the LiveViewer category. So let's strap in, get some coffee, and let's get started. Oh, by the way, and if you like this video, next week there's going to be a rendering gotcha if the response is similar to last week's video. So let me know if you like it, if you want to see rendering gotchas. Let's get going now. So let's first talk about brightness values, as those might be more complicated than you think. So let's hit the light tag here, and first of all let's explain surface brightness. So surface brightness, when we tick that off, our light gets insanely bright. Let's compensate for that real quick, so let's make the value extremely low. Here we go. So what surface brightness is doing when it's ticked off is that the power that is provided to the light is constant. So when I go and make my light source bigger or smaller, the light source actually gets brighter or dimmer because it needs to distribute the same amount of energy through its area. And this is exactly what you want to do if you light your scene and don't have an exact light size in mind and don't want to readjust your brightness of your light source all the time. But on the other hand, if you have constant light sources like LEDs or illuminated buttons in your scene that you need the light brightness to be constant, it's best to use surface brightness. Now I've set the surface brightness on and the power to 1, and you might expect this light now being pure white because the range from 0, which means black, to 1, which means white, if you're not having a tone mapped LiveViewer, should be respected. So let's color pick that here, and it's around 87%. So it's not pure white. Why is that? First of all, to have pure color, let's eliminate everything that might be interfering with it. So let's go to main here and set this to a texture emission. And you notice it gets even darker, so it's now 72%. So what can we do? Actually, the answer is in the nodes, so let's produce the nodes for our light and go with a float texture set to 1. And you might know already where this is leading, so if we plug that into texture and also distribution, you can see now when we sample our light, it is the expected value. So let's prove the point and bring it home. So when we go to power and set it to 0.5, this value should have the value of 0.5. Now it doesn't. And the reason for that is that we are looking through an sRGB tone curve. So we need to look through a linear representation. So if we go to linear here and then sample again, yes, now our value is 0.5 and we are having calibrated our light, so to speak. So the takeaway is you don't know what values reside in those slots. This value is not always 1, and you can take full control if you pipe in the value you want, and therefore there is no mistake. On to our next gotcha, which is very saturated lights. So let's produce that by going with an RGB spectrum, make that pure red, and then pipe that into the texture slot here. Now, this is still looking normal, but if we increase the light's intensity to a higher value, for example 50, you can see now the light is looking flaky and not nice anymore. And it even gets worse the brighter the light gets. Here we go. This is because Octane is spectral and it can't handle the single peak that the one RGB spectrum here is producing. So we can help Octane by introducing a Gaussian spectrum. Here we go. So the Gaussian spectrum actually is a wavelength and its width inside of the range of visible light. So if we plug that in, of course this is not producing the right color from the start. So what we need to do is go to a wavelength of 1 and also minimize the width, but not make it too small to produce artifacts. So if we go for a value of 0.05, this seems to be fine. Now, due to the mechanics of wavelength, this light is gotten a lot darker now, but even if we compensate, we don't get the speckles anymore and it's producing clean results. Now obviously this is not looking realistic. Our eyes tend to desaturate light sources the brighter they get, so this should be white or orange or something like that. To get this result you need an ACES transform or even HEX. I have tutorials on those as well. Alright, the next gotcha is the Octane Spotlight. So if you're coming from other renderers, you might be used to a plethora of different lights. So if we produce a spotlight to go to Objects, Lights, and then Octane Volumetric Spotlight, because it's the only spotlight listed here, let's go outside of the camera and show you. So what we have here, if we angle it down a little, is a different set of features. So you have a volumetric cone here. Also you have barn doors. And this might be a little bit too much to start with, especially if you're only looking for a normal spotlight. So what people tend to not know is that you can create a spotlight from any area light. So let's go to Objects, Lights, and then Area Light. Let's make this a little bit smaller here. Here we go. And then put it to the same position roughly. Angle it down. And what we need to do here is go to the Lights nodes. Here we go. And then produce a spotlight distribution. Here we go. So what this is doing when we pipe that into the distribution is creating exactly what the name suggests, a spotlight. So you can change the cone angle here and the hardness and stuff like that, just as in a spotlight, but without all the disturbing features that the Octane Volumetric Spotlight comes with. Now there's two of them. This is getting out of hand. Let me know if you know where this reference is coming from. So I need two light sources to go over our next topic, which is sampling rate. Now if you're coming from a biased render engine such as Redshift, the samples always increase the light's quality. And path traces such as Octane work differently, and it can be a gotcha if you don't know how. So to demonstrate, let me increase the sampling of the right light source here to 5. I hope that you can see through YouTube's compression algorithm that our sampling of the right light source is now better, but what's also important to notice is that the left light source is now sampled worse without us changing the sampling rate of that light source. And this is exactly the important point here. The sampling of Octane is not a sample count, but a sampling ratio. So setting this light to 5 while the other light stays at 1 means that this light is 5 times more likely to receive samples. So instead of receiving more samples, it actually takes away other samples from the light source on the left side. I would say Octane's light sampling is rather balanced on its own, and very few times require the actual change of a sampling rate. The only time you would really need to do that is if one light is really noisy compared to all the other lights in your scene. Last but not least, let's prove the point that this is really a sampling ratio rather than a sample count by going to both lights and raise the sampling rate to 1000 here. Here we go. And let's actually make this a A/B comparison here to store it in the render buffer. And then what we need to do is go and set the right light to 5000. So we have the same ratio here again, and then store that to the render buffer again. Then go back to a sampling level of 1 for both lights actually. So here we go. And then also store that in the render buffer. And then go to the old ratio of 1 to 5 again. And also store that. Now let me move the A/B comparison slider to the left so we only see the stored pictures here. And let's go to the image 1, which is both lights having 1000. And let's go to the image 3, which both lights having 1. And you can see no difference in those pictures. Now the samples are a little bit different, but essentially the noise is the same. And the same happens with the ratio being the same. So this is the picture where this light has 1000 and this 5000. And you can see the noise ratio is the same as in this picture where this light has a sampling value of 1 and this of 5. So both of those sampling ratios are 5 to 1, and it shows in the tests we did right now. Again, Octane's sampling algorithm is rather stable, so you don't have to mess with sampling rate unless you see something really off in your scene. Now, on to the next point. Okay, this is the last one of the light section, and it's probably more a quick tip than a gotcha. So, since around 2019, Octane got its own light sources. What does this even mean? So before, all lights in Octane were basically emissive polygons. Now Octane has its light sources and they're called light primitives. So especially when converting old scenes, you can check every light if this tick is ticked. Because if not, your sampling is a little bit worse. It's not the world, but it's a little bit. I don't know if you can see it through YouTube's compression algorithm, but you can see here this light is rather grainy here. And when I tick use primitives, then with the same low samples as in the chapter before, it is looking a lot more noise free. And this is essentially what use primitives is giving you. It's a little bit better sampling of light sources. Okay, I think a shoutout is in order. So massive shoutout to Scott Benson. Now, due to the structure of my videos in compressing all of those gotchas in a small time frame, I don't have the time to go into a lot of detail. And Scott Benson is doing exactly that in his written up articles on Behance. So if you're interested in a deeper dive into every one of those topics I mention, then I highly recommend his Behance page. The link is down in the description below. Now on to the next chapter, which is Scene. Welcome to our new chapter. So if I direct your attention to the render here, you can see it's rather bluish here and also has a vignette. So basically the first thought would be to go to the camera imager and set the settings here. But in the camera imager, everything is looking normal. Also, I might want to direct your attention to the denoised pass here, which is turned on. So let's go to the denoiser, and no, it's not turned on in here either. So what is going on? Basically, the gotcha here is that every camera tag in Octane can have its own camera imager. And while this is sometimes needed, for example, for architectural visualization, sometimes it's a real pain in the ass to troubleshoot. So I can just simply turn that off and get back to our normal renderings, or in other words, what we have set in the camera imager globally. Or we can turn that on and troubleshoot it here, for example, just turn off the denoising, and this will make the denoising disappear from our list. On to the next point, which is the lack of Octane to produce nested render instances. What do I mean by that? Let's go for the material ball here and instance that in an efficient way. So let's go and hit instance and move it to the side. So everything works as expected until I switch it to a render instance. And now you can see some parts are missing. And let's investigate that. Here we go. So inside of the original object, there is already this part here turned to a render instance inside of the object. And if you use a render instance inside of a group that is render instanced, nested render instancing, then it's not displayed anymore. So the way to deal with that is to turn off render instancing in the original object, or instance this part to both of the objects as an original instance. Next point in our scene chapter, which is taking place in a different scene here. So I have this glass, which you know from other tutorials if you watch my tutorials, and we have this glass material. So now if I assign it, what is this? We have a chrome glass now. Basically what's happening here is the glass having inverted normals, and this is something you need to look out for, especially with transparent materials. So just right click here and then invert your normals or reverse your normals, and now your glass is looking a-okay. Small interlude. So if you like this channel and the content on it, you actually can support me by becoming a Patreon. And the best part about that is that you're not only supporting me making those videos and sharing more knowledge, you also gain access to scenes like this here. So you can look around them and even use them commercially. And this is actually no matter what tier you subscribe to. If you're interested, head over to my Patreon, the link is down in the description below. Also, I'm available for trainings, sessions and one-to-ones online as well as on location. So if you're interested in increasing your knowledge this way, absolutely feel free to contact me. Now on to the next point. Alright, last one in the scenes context. Next we are continuing with LiveViewer, but this here is very interesting and can lead to some major gotchas. So this one is a cube with a decal on it, and this does not work in some contexts with render instances. So let's create a render instance of that cube here. Here we go. And then move it over a little bit. Here we go also, and make it a render instance. So right now all works flawlessly until we decide to hide the original cube. Now I can't just turn it off here because that also turns off the render instance. But what we can do is hide it inside of a null and then turn off the null. Now, while this is working with undecaled materials, you can see the flaw here. So we are left only with the decal in the render instance when the original object is invisible to the render. To work around that, what we can do is going back to the render instance and actually set it back to normal instancing, and this will solve the problem. But of course, if you have a bigger scene, that might be more resource intensive. So another way to do that is to leave that original cube enabled, but then hide it by moving it out of sight. And this might be the better option, leaving all the original geometry somewhere in the scene, not visible inside of the field of view, reflections and so on. This is sort of a crossover between scene and LiveViewer. We are talking about motion blur now. And of course, this is a really big topic and I can't explain everything in detail, but let's get started here. So I have the scene where my material ball is turning rather fast and I want to see motion blur. So we have to first do a lot of things to make this happen. First of all, we need to go into the camera, under motion blur and enable it. And then we have to adjust the shutter time to get the right amount of motion blur. Fortunately, in the newer versions of Octane, there are some settings here that make life easier. So if you're a film enthusiast and always like the way films look, I encourage you to go to angle and leave it at 180 degrees. Now if we go ahead and move our object, there's still no motion blur in the LiveViewer, and this is because the object doesn't have an Octane tag. So let's go to right-click, extensions, and then object tag here. And inside of the motion blur, now it's set to transform, and this should work. So let's go through it. Doesn't work at all. Now let's re-render here and let's see if this works. Yes, finally it works. So sometimes it needs to have a re-render to start working. So here we go, we have motion blur, but now you can see that the motion blur is looking kind of funky here. And this is because the LiveViewer has only a one substep motion blur. And especially with rotations, you need more than one substep. And you need a final render to see the whole substep range. So let's final render here. And it's looking exactly the same as in the LiveViewer. And the reason being that when we stop rendering here and go into our settings, the samples per frame is set to 1 also for the final render. So let's just crank it up to 5 here and render again. And now you have the rotational motion blur that you're expecting. So if I render in the LiveViewer again, you can see even though with the setting set to 5 here, this is only reflected in the final rendering, not in the LiveViewer. Remember that. Okay, next, still LiveViewer, and this is a topic here that people tend to get confused about. So this is a lot of settings here, so what to choose? Usually if you do nothing to your image, you should use that LDR or HDR sRGB. There's basically no difference between those. Don't use the HDR linear sRGB as this gives you the darker version or the raw version of your render. This is only good to pick colors, for example, as we did before. If you have loaded a custom OpenColor.io file here in the settings under color management, you can also choose the OpenColor.io here and then go back to the camera imager OpenColor.io and choose what profile you want to set. And this will be reflected on your screen here. Now, this is another set of confusion. So inside of the camera imager, under imager, there's this new ACES tone mapping. If I tick that while in OpenColor.io mode, nothing is happening. This only is reflected inside of the LDR and HDR modes here. So now we can toggle it, but as soon as I go to OpenColor.io mode, this doesn't have power over that. So basically, get your priorities right. The ACES tone mapping only has priorities in those modes, while the OpenColor.io only has priority in this mode. Okay, while we're at the LiveViewer, just one more thing. Sometimes your renders start to look strange and you don't have a reason why, so you re-render and it doesn't solve the problem. And you have your reflections right here, but they don't show on screen. And when you're in such a situation, I want to turn your attention to this small button here, which is the clay mode. So one more click and everything is fixed. So you can toggle through clay modes here, and sometimes you hit that accidentally and then you're stuck in some clay mode and can't figure out why reflections won't render, for example. I myself had that more times than I want to admit, and it would be so nice if people would have told me that I was stuck in the second mode of clay mode, and then just one more press would fix all my troubles. The next one is about scale attributes. So sometimes you have a different aspect ratio and you want that to reflect on your LiveViewer. So you hit that toggle here with the lock, and then scale the image down to match your view. So something like this. And I purposefully made the resolution quite large to show you something. So what we are doing right here is we are still rendering in UHD, but we scale down our image to fit our picture viewer. So you can zoom back in and get the full resolution. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. So for example, if you don't, it's a better idea to just scale down the rendering altogether. So right now we are just rendering the pixels we see and don't produce that overhead of a 4K render that needs a lot more rendering time than this. Alright, we are almost at the end, so this is the last point for this week. If you liked this week's video and are down for rendering gotchas, definitely let me know in the comments. This last one is pretty much along the lines what we had before, and this is when we are dealing with our scenes and maybe just go outside of the camera real quick here and move around, and you can see the LiveViewer is updating. Now we decide to move some objects, so let's move this here, and no update is happening, so you have to re-render in order to get the update. There is something wrong. Now, this something that is wrong might be just an accidental click here on some of those symbols up here. And those enable or disable updates for different sections of the scene. For example, I just accidentally had disabled my object updates. So if I enable it again and move my object, you can see that now this is working again. And you have updates for lights, cameras, and last but not least, materials. So if you're having some scene update problems, it is worth checking those buttons here if some of them or one of them is activated. And this concludes this week's video. I hope you liked it and learned something from it. Let me know in the comments if you like to continue this path with render gotchas next week. And as always, I like to thank my Patreons for their support and making videos like this possible. A massive shout out to my €50 subscribers, Gilles Augustinen and Leon Studio TV. Also a huge thanks for the €15 subscriber support to George Luna, Laon, Marty Kane, Part 1 of 2, Raiko, Render King aka Alessandro Bonchio, Scene CGI, Shamus Johnson, and Yassin Rupp. Thanks so much for all of you and all the Patreons' help for making this possible. I am very happy that every week we get more and more Patreon subscribers and therefore on the way to our goal in making this channel independent and not reliant on client work so much anymore. As always, if you're still watching, thank you very much for staying with me that long. I wish you a great time and happy rendering. Bye!